Well, good evening, everyone. Let's just wait a minute while everybody comes into Zoom so we can start our program. Good evening, everyone. I'm Janet Church, CEO of the Sjogren's Foundation, and thank you so much for coming to tonight's town hall meeting for foundation members. We have over 600 people with us this evening, and I'm so pleased to see you all here. I'm also pleased to welcome back Dr. Cassandra Calabrese to our town hall format to share her knowledge about COVID-19, vaccines, boosters, and Sjogren's. Before I formally introduce Dr. Calabrese, I'd like to give you all a quick update on what's happening at the foundation. First of all, we just held our conference on the nervous system and Sjogren's this past Saturday, and it was a huge success. I know many of you joined us, and you were part of the 1,068 attendees of this conference. We received so many glowing remarks from attendees, and we are so happy that people found the topics timely and important to you. If you did not register for the conference and are interested, the videos are available for download from our website in just a couple of days. But if you were at the conference and saw my foundation update, well, the next few minutes are going to sound really familiar because these are the most important updates at this time. This has truly been a transformational year for the foundation and for Sjogren's. In addition to me joining as the CEO, this year we have had considerable research investments, advances in new therapeutics, and greater awareness in the medical community about the systemic nature of Sjogren's. Educating medical providers is one of our key missions, and it will be for some time. And a huge step toward educating all medical providers just happened on October 1st, and that is the launch of new ICD-10 codes for Sjogren's. The updates include the critical change of using Zika, meaning dry, to using Sjogren. Medical providers now have an expanded list of codes that provide a more accurate representation of the disease, including codes that address systemic issues of Sjogren's. These changes went into effect in the US on October 1st, and the World Health Organization will incorporate the changes internationally in its next ICD code update. This is one of our biggest successes this year, and it was years in the making. Our awareness ambassadors, which are volunteers that go into doctors' offices, will be taking our new ICD-10 code card, which is pictured on this slide, and will take them into the doctor's offices. You can also take a similar item to your doctors by going to our website and downloading the ICD-10 code flyer from the resources section. And now you will still see the term Sjogren's syndrome. You know that we have dropped the use of the word syndrome, but language changes such as dropping syndrome take a lot of time, especially when it needs to matriculate through a major system. But the important thing now is that the word Sjogren's with additional codes that really highlight the systemic nature of the disease have been added. Next, rheumatologists are learning more about Sjogren's. Just last week, the American College of Rheumatology had their conference. We had 2 symposia on Sjogren's, many abstracts and posters, a childhood Sjogren's work group, and a special presentation on pulmonary complications in Sjogren's patients. We also held our annual meeting at ACR, which brought in global rheumatologists and researchers. In fact, Dr. Calabrese was also a presenter at that meeting. The topic was understanding Sjogren's through COVID-19 dysautonomia, and the discussion was fascinating. And I know it will continue to be a major discussion among medical experts for what they are learning about COVID dysautonomia, how that might relate to autoimmune and Sjogren's dysautonomia. Next, I want to mention our pulmonary clinical practice guidelines that came out last year and were published in the journal Chest in February. This is the pulmonologist key journal, and the guidelines have been downloaded over 14,000 times from their website, referenced in 9 professional articles, presented at 2 scientific conferences, and covered in trusted medical outlets like Medscape. This is a huge step toward cross-disciplinary education and communication among medical providers treating Sjogren's patients. We are now focused on advancing our peripheral nervous system guidelines, and they are a real priority at the foundation, but they do take time to create. Soon, we will be turning our attention to educating primary care providers about Sjogren's. As you all know, our PCPs may not know much at all about Sjogren's and how to help manage our symptoms. I'm thrilled to inform you that Sjogren's will be featured in the February 2022 PriMed virtual conference called Primary Care Now. PriMed is the go-to resource for continued learning for primary care providers, and our session is titled Spotting Sjogren's: Keys to Successful Diagnosis for PCPs. And our own Dr. Donald Thomas, chair of our board of directors, will be presenting. And after the conference, the session will be posted on the PriMed's website for 1 year, where providers can take the course and receive CME credit. So after February 22nd, we're going to encourage you to let your PCPs know that they can take the Sjogren CME course, and we'll remind you of that in the new year. And let's talk about the area that shows the biggest promise for making a change in the world of Sjogren's. And this is the pharmaceutical companies, large and small, investing in therapy specifically for Sjogren's. When I first started in February, we had 12 active clinical trials for specific Sjogren's therapies. I was thrilled about that, but now we have 15 companies working on 21 systemic therapies in clinical trials for Sjogren's. This is remarkable. It's a huge change that brings great promise for future treatments. With companies investing in systemic therapies, there will be a change in how medical providers categorize the disease. They will know that Sjogren's is systemic and it is serious. However, your help is needed here because successful trials require patient enrollment. And if you are interested in learning about a clinical trial, do go to our website under the clinical trials area, or you can respond to one of our member emails. I know you've been seeing them and recognizing how many clinical trials are in activation. But do know that calling to inquire does not mean you are committing to the trial, but do call and learn more. Even calling without participating does show companies that there is interest and need. We can't bring new therapies to market without patient participation. So I encourage you to go to our website, look up some research and clinical trials, and see if you are interested in giving one a call. Last, I want to highlight our investments in research, and you've heard me talk a lot about this before, and for very good reason. We are seeing research programs that will change the way we look at Sjogren's and what we know about patients. First, we just received all of the input from patients for our new survey, Living with Sjogren's. Over 3,600 people took the survey, and if you did, thank you so much. Thank you for using your voice. The data is currently being analyzed, and we will begin communicating what we've learned in early 2022. I'm excited to learn what's new and how it compares to the 2016 data, which is the last Living with Sjogren's survey. And I'm excited to update our medical providers on what the data tells us. Biomarkers are the future of Sjogren's. Biomarkers provide a whole new approach to looking at the disease, and 3 of our 4 spring research grants focus on biomarkers. By identifying biomarkers that are specifically linked with Sjogren's and biological pathways, we will be able to approach the disease in a very precise way. This will revolutionize how we look at Sjogren's and will lead to better and faster diagnosis, improved clinical management, and greater success of clinical trials leading to new therapeutics. The Foundation recognizes how important biomarkers are to the future of Sjogren's and is making it a priority in our research efforts. And in fact, I am pleased to share that the Sjogren's Foundation has joined a 5-year large-scale public-private partnership to better understand the cellular and molecular disease pathways in autoimmune disease. The partnership will prioritize Sjogren's disease as one of 5 autoimmune diseases interrogated, along with lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, and psoriatic arthritis, and will include the broad sharing and analysis of an unprecedented and comprehensive data set. The Foundation has committed to join the National Institutes of Health, several large pharmaceutical companies, and other disease advocacy partners as steering committee members to provide strategic guidance and decisions on the focus and direction of this emerging program. You'll be hearing a lot more about this program in the new year, and it is going to be an incredible program and an incredible learning experience. And finally, allow me to highlight our co-funded grant with Dysautonomia International. Sjogren's is the second most identifiable cause of autonomic neuropathy and has been associated with POTS and other forms of dysautonomia, as we learned in Saturday's conference. The Foundation has partnered with Dysautonomia International to fund a research grant to study Sjogren's and POTS, and we're currently in review of the proposals. We anticipate an announcement fairly soon, so be sure to watch our website and hear who has won the award. So these are the big items we're working on now, along with all of our other patient services and medical providers programs. And I know so many of you on this call have not only participated in programs, but donated to the Foundation, so we are able to make these investments. And we are so very, very grateful for your generous support, so we can make these investments and make a difference in patients' lives. Now it's time to turn to our main topic, COVID-19, vaccines, and Sjogren's. And I'm delighted to introduce all of you to Dr. Cassandra Calabrese. We have been so fortunate to have her expertise on our Foundation's Sjogren's and COVID-19 Vaccination Committee. Dr. Calabrese has been integral to how the Foundation has kept you informed about the pandemic and what we as Sjogren's patients can do for ourselves and our families. As we have done with all of our COVID and vaccine town halls, we will post this video on our website for all patients to see after this evening. But we present to our members first and give you the chance to submit questions for the doctor, which we do have plenty. Dr. Calabrese not only serves on our vaccine committee, but also served on the American College of Rheumatology COVID-19 vaccine clinical guidance team. Dr. Calabrese holds joint appointments in rheumatology and infectious disease at the Cleveland Clinic. She specializes in infections in the setting of immunosuppressive treatment for rheumatic diseases and rheumatic manifestations of infectious diseases, and has a particular interest in infection prevention and immunization. We're so honored to have Dr. Calabrese with us to continue our learning about vaccines and Sjogren's. And Dr. Calabrese, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I'm really honored to be here to talk with you all and have the opportunity to share information about COVID vaccines and have a discussion addressing hesitancy and concerns and clarifying recommendations, and we'll leave plenty of time at the end for questions. So thank you for having me. To set the stage, I want to say, unfortunately, COVID is not going anywhere anytime soon. It's going to be with us for a long while, and we hope it to become more manageable and the pandemic to end in the near future. And while there are different outpatient treatment options in the pipeline, including oral antivirals, the best mode of treatment is preventing the infection in the first place with vaccines. And vaccination is what we can do to protect ourselves and our loved ones from COVID-19. And the priority, of course, is to first vaccinate the unvaccinated, but now coming to the forefront, our discussion about boosting, and that is quite important too. And more important for some than others, which is what we'll talk about. But this is what we can do to protect ourselves and our loved ones. And I hope to provide information and clarification. If you feel you read something confusing about COVID vaccine recommendations or recommendations for additional doses or boosters, or if you feel someone told you something confusing or heard different things from different people, then you're not alone, because the recommendations are not entirely clear and are confusing. And that's one of my goals here, is to clarify what are the recommendations for whom, and to have a lot of question and answer at the end. So just to start, I wanted to show this slide. This is a screenshot from the COVID-19 Global Rheumatology Alliance. And I'm sure some of you have heard of this. This has been the most pivotal ongoing study, which has taught us what we know about COVID-19 and how it affects patients with rheumatic diseases, including Sjogren's. This is a worldwide study that was created way back in March of 2020, and physicians, healthcare workers entered data on their patients who had COVID, and this is where we've learned so much information. And this is where we've learned about impact of COVID on our patients, including different risk factors for getting really sick, which includes medications and comorbidities, other diagnoses like hypertension. But this has taught us so much. And what it has taught us is that risk factors from needing to be in the hospital if you have COVID, or dying from COVID, traditional risk factors really are at the forefront. Older age, by far and large, is the hugest risk factor for getting really sick if you have COVID. Up there with that are traditional risk factors that we know very well now, having other chronic comorbidities, heart disease, obesity, chronic lung disease, chronic kidney disease, diabetes, pregnancy. The list goes on. This list is not exhaustive, but these are the kind of traditional risk factors that we now know very well, or increase your risk of getting really sick if you have COVID. I don't highlight here is there are a lot of young people that also get really sick when they have COVID, and we don't fully understand that. So it's certainly not guaranteed if you're young and otherwise healthy that you'll cruise through a COVID infection, but these risk factors significantly elevate your risk of having poor outcomes. In patients with Sjogren's, this can be a complex picture or gray area if you don't have one of these other chronic comorbidities. But if you have Sjogren's and have another risk factor for COVID, that is a risk factor for getting really sick if you have COVID. Things separate from those comorbidities and specific to Sjogren's, which I'll talk a little bit more about at the end, could be risk factors too. And that specifically is talking about medications to treat Sjogren's. And not all medications used to treat Sjogren's suppress the immune system or might elevate your risk of poor outcomes from COVID. But what we have learned from many studies, in particular, and first from that Global Rheumatology Alliance study that I showed, being on chronic prednisone, specifically a dose equivalent of 10 milligrams or more daily, and being treated with rituximab, this is associated not specifically with getting COVID more easily, but if you get COVID, with getting very sick, potentially being in the hospital and dying. I really love to show this graph from the CDC looking at risk of hospitalization and death by age group. I'll often get questions from patients or emails saying, hey, I'm a healthy 54-year-old. I don't think I need the COVID vaccine. I don't have any other problems. What do you think about that? And I send them this graph. Even if you're a healthy 54-year-old, you still have a 25 times higher risk of being hospitalized compared to someone who's 20 or younger, and hundreds of times higher risk of dying if you're a healthy 50 or 60 something. And that risk, as you can see, gets significantly increased as we move to the right of this table. Age remains the driver of poor outcomes from COVID, and that risk rockets as you move from 60 to 70 to 80 and beyond. So while we field many questions from patients with rheumatic diseases about their personal risk and their drugs and their underlying disease, at the end of the day, even if they're just older than a healthy 30-year-old, that is significant implications for getting really sick if you have COVID. And I think that's important to highlight. So here is my first slide about the COVID vaccine recommendations. And this is recommendations for the initial series. And COVID vaccine is recommended for everyone. As you all know, the Pfizer vaccine was approved initially for 16 and up, and just last month for 5 and up, which is pretty exciting. And there's essentially no contraindication to receiving a COVID vaccine unless you have a life-threatening allergy to a component of the COVID vaccine, or you got your first dose and had a life-threatening allergic reaction to the first dose. Then you should not get a second dose. Short of that, there is no absolute contraindication in anyone to getting a COVID vaccine. These are the recommendations. I don't know if you have seen, this is a newer recommendation. Anyone who got Johnson & Johnson vaccine is actually recommended now to get a second dose, and that's not technically considered a booster. It's considered the full series is 2 doses, 8 weeks or more apart. The Pfizer series is 2 doses, 3 weeks apart, and Mrna is 2 doses, 4 weeks or more apart. It's okay to get it farther apart, not okay to get them closer together. And as I said, Pfizer vaccine is FDA approved, currently only FDA approved COVID vaccine, which is fantastic, but has emergency use authorization for 5 and up, FDA approved for 16 and up. So what is this boosting? What does this mean? Who needs a booster? What is that? And when should I get it? So the first very big point of confusion that I hope to clarify is this vocabulary here and how the CDC has used the word boosting. And the most important thing to note first is that the CDC recommendations for a booster or an additional COVID vaccine dose for immunocompromised patients is completely separate from their recommendation for non-immunocompromised patients. And we'll talk about what defines an immunocompromised patients on the subsequent slides. But I, for example, am a healthcare worker, so I'm indicated to get a booster, and that is my booster. I had my initial 2-dose series of Mrna, and 6 months later, I got a booster. If I were immunocompromised, my 3rd Mrna dose would not be considered a booster. It would actually be considered standard of care for me to get 3 Mrna doses, and that is what's recommended for immunocompromised persons. And that 3rd dose is called an additional dose, and that 3-shot series is their standard of care, whereas a booster is an additional 3rd dose for someone who's not immunocompromised. And the timing recommendations are different. And if you're confused right now, that's okay. A lot of people are. This is confusing. So the emergency use authorization recommendation for a 3rd dose of mRNA vaccine, so Pfizer or Mrna, for immunocompromised persons was this recommendation first came out in August. Applies to people who got Pfizer or Mrna, and this was recommended to receive a 3rd additional dose for certain immunocompromised persons, and we'll talk about what that means. It's preferred to be the same type of vaccine you got your initial 2-shot series with, but it doesn't have to be, and it is okay to mix and match. Say you got your first 2 Mrna to get a 3rd Pfizer, that is okay. The timing recommendation is for this 3rd dose to be given anytime 28 days or later after your 2nd dose of the vaccine. The biggest point of confusion, perhaps, has been the Mrna dose. For the booster recommendations for non-immunocompromised persons, the 3rd Mrna shot is a half dose. The booster is a half dose. So when I got my 3rd Mrna, it was the half dose booster shot. For immunocompromised persons getting their 3rd Mrna dose, if they got Mrna, or if their 3rd dose is a Mrna, since that's not technically considered a booster, it's not a booster dose, and it's a full Mrna dose, so 3 full Mrnas. So for our patients, for my patients who meet this definition for immunocompromised, the 3rd dose is not really a booster, but is now part of recommended immunizations for those with compromised immune systems, because it's felt that you might not generate as robust immune response after just 2 doses. So the CDC has left this verbiage very vague. If you look on the CDC website of how they define immunocompromised persons, it's very vague and it's actually very strict. Where in reality, the intention was for healthcare providers to interpret this differently, and many different academic centers and institutions have defined what they feel to be an immunocompromised patient or a patient who warrants an additional dose due to their immune status. And we at Cleveland Clinic are doing something different than they're doing at Johns Hopkins or Mayo, and that's okay. At the Cleveland Clinic, we have a more broad recommendation. We feel that everyone only has potential to benefit from a booster, and that it's not going to hurt and unlikely to hurt. So we have a less confusing, more all-encompassing and broad definition of who has a compromised immune system. And we feel that to be essentially all of our patients who are on any sort of immunosuppressive or immunomodulating drug, most of which I've listed here. We do not include patients who are on Plaquenil or hydroxychloroquine monotherapy because we don't feel that that drug suppresses your immune system to any significant degree. But you can see here common things: any dose of chronic daily prednisone, methotrexate, Arava, Cellcept, the list goes on. And this is how we interpreted this. And this is open to interpretation differently by different healthcare providers. But I think at the end of the day, it's important to focus on the data that drove the recommendation for a booster. And that's data looking at incidence of COVID after some time after completing the initial 2-shot series, and that immunity does wane. We do feel that in most patients, your protection is probably still pretty good, 6 months after your initial shot series, at least against preventing hospitalization and death. The protection against getting infected in the first place is clearly lower than it was closer to when you got your initial 2-shot series. And where the discrepancy is, who has potential to have lost more immunity than others is older age, 60 and older, 65 and older, and then people who have a compromised immune system from different drugs. And different drugs we use confer different levels of decreased immune risk. But how I like to put things in perspective is other countries are boosting everyone, even children. And I don't think that's wrong. And I like to put things in perspective for me. If someone thinks me, a healthy 30-something with no comorbidities, they think I need a booster, then why doesn't everyone need a booster? And interestingly, and perhaps timely, the Pfizer submitted to the FDA just this week for emergency authorization for everyone to get a booster with Pfizer. And I think that's the way we're going. So while most people probably have still good protection against hospitalization and death, some do not, including if you're older or have comorbidities or are on certain drugs. And the goal of the additional dose is to boost that immunity back up where it was initially and get back to that excellent protection against getting infected in the first place and getting really sick and dying. And as you can see here, there's some other things that qualify as being immunocompromised, including having HIV, or if you have CVID, or on IVIG replacement therapy, or a variety of cancers and their treatments. So the FDA authorization for the booster shot, the booster for the non-immunocompromised persons, which could potentially include Sjogren's patients who are not on one of those immunosuppressive therapies I listed, you could very well qualify for a booster for a lot of other reasons, including if you're 65 or older, or if you're 50 and up with a variety of underlying medical conditions. And the list for that is very long and includes diabetes and cardiovascular disease and chronic lung disease and chronic heart disease. And then there's also a kind of subcategory of patients who may be eligible for a booster. And as I say all this, I remind you this may all be a moot point as soon as the end of the week when we hear that we all are going to need boosters anyway. But this kind of helps to set the stage and prioritize who it is extra important for them to get a booster based on their comorbidities. So all these underlying conditions. Pregnancy counts as a risk factor for poor outcomes with COVID. That's very similar to influenza. And anyone who has a high-risk job, which includes healthcare workers. I put here at the bottom, the FDA has authorized a mix and match strategy. Tells us it's okay to swap Pfizer for Moderna. As I said before, if you got your first two Moderna and the CVS you go to only has Pfizer, that's okay to get your booster with Pfizer if they don't have Moderna. And there's actually no preference for one or the other, mixing and matching, not mixing or matching. It's safe and it's effective and it's okay to get a booster. We prefer any booster over no booster. The Johnson & Johnson recommendations for a second dose. This is new and different. They recommended for anyone who got Johnson & Johnson to get a second dose 8 weeks or more later. This is for everyone, not based on risk or comorbidities. And there are a lot of people who early on who were immunocompromised, who needed another dose, who initially got Johnson & Johnson, went and got another dose of Pfizer, Moderna. That's completely okay too, and very effective. And CDC has not commented on any other boosting for someone who got Johnson & Johnson yet. So let's stay tuned for that. This is very kind of hot off the press and has sparked much discussion. With CDC recommending for some immunocompromised people, probably driven by risk factors I showed on the previous slides, should get a proper booster 6 months after their 3-dose series. This only applies to people who got Pfizer or Moderna. So if you're a Sjogren's patient who's on Cellcept or methotrexate, and you got your 3 Pfizers or 3 Modernas in 6 months, you may be getting another dose, a booster. So hopefully that's not too confusing, but this is the actual booster, or what I like to call the booster for immunocompromised persons. Flu vaccine, I think it's really important to note this year. Last year, the year before, we didn't see a lot of flu. Everyone was isolating, everyone was wearing masks. That was a positive about the pandemic, but this year it's projected there will be a lot more influenza circulating and everyone should get a flu vaccine. This is not to be skipped this year. It is okay to get your COVID vaccine and your flu vaccine on the same day. I've had many patients do that without any issues at all. You can technically co-administer COVID vaccine with any vaccine. We don't have a lot of data on that, but we feel it's safe. Might you have more side effects? Might your arm hurt more? If you really don't want to, that's completely fine. But it's also perfectly fine and safe to get both on the same day. Can even get them in the same arm. They just have to be given at a different injection site. So I think that is important to note. This is a really common question that we get. So I wanted to give it its own slide, as I'm sure there'll be lots of questions about this at the end. Fear of having a flare of your underlying rheumatic disease, a flare of your Sjogren's after the COVID vaccine. This probably specific concerns about the underlying autoimmune rheumatic disease we've known from survey-based studies or what drives a lot of rheumatic disease patients' vaccine hesitancy. Fear their disease will flare is number one. So we, as Janet said, we had our American College of Rheumatology meeting last week. There was much COVID research and data presented. We talked a lot about this. There have been many studies done on this. And there to date are no data, no studies to suggest any risk of significantly increased risk of a rheumatic disease flare after the COVID vaccine. Does that mean the risk is zero? No, but the risk is not significant. If a flare happens, the severity of the flare is low and manageable. And the signal is just not there. We like to share this with patients. We feel this is very important. Oftentimes what happens, which on my next slide, we'll talk about the American College of Vaccine guidance for potentially timing vaccine around medicines, or depending on what medicines you're at, holding certain medicines. So say my patient, who is on methotrexate for inflammatory arthritis or some Sjogren's manifestations, say I want, after shared informed decision making, for them to hold that for a dose or two after their COVID vaccine to make sure their immune system has good response. They could potentially flare just from being off their methotrexate. What also is important to know is what we call the reactogenicity after the COVID vaccines. I know many of you have experienced this, and if not, you've heard about it. Your immune system's response to having a COVID vaccine, or your immune system doing its job in response to having COVID vaccine, ramping up and making antibodies against the virus. This is called reactogenicity. This ranges from local reactogenicity, arm pain, swelling, or redness, to systemic reactogenicity, fevers, chills, headaches, joint pain, muscle pain. This is reactogenicity. It is reflective of the vaccine doing its job. If you didn't experience it, doesn't mean the vaccine didn't do its job. But this is not unique to COVID vaccine. If any of you have had the new shingles vaccine, Shingrix, the side effect profile is actually rather comparable. But for patients to know that feeling really badly after your first or second COVID vaccine is not something scary or something that's not supposed to happen. And while it might be terribly uncomfortable, it goes away really quickly, and that's reflective of your immune system doing its job. I've met a lot of patients who gave that as a reason for not being vaccinated. They heard their friend, felt like they were dying after their second COVID vaccine, and that scared them. And I think to remind everyone that that's normal and not scary and will go away, and reflective of your immune system doing its job is really important to know. So in general, for patients that do have fear about a flare, which is real and not to be discounted, we like to look at the relative risk or put things in perspective. The risk of dying from COVID is significant versus the risk of a flare of Sjogren's, which is low, and if it occurs, is manageable with medicine and working with your doctor, while the risk of getting really sick with COVID is not. Another question is, do people with multiple autoimmune diseases have a greater risk of having a flare of one of their diseases after a COVID vaccine? And the answer is no, which I hope is reassuring. This was just one of the many, many studies presented at ACR last week. Big, nicely done study showing that there's no link between increased risk of flare in any rheumatic disease. No link associated with flare and getting a mRNA COVID vaccine. This is a common question that I get asked by a lot of patients with a lot of different underlying diseases, including Sjogren's. Am I immunocompromised? How immunocompromised am I? Am I immunocompromised just because I have Sjogren's if I'm on no medication? And this answer is largely dependent on what drug you're receiving as treatment. As the drugs drive the immunocompromised status. You might have other risk factors to elevate your risk of doing really poorly with COVID, like older age or chronic heart disease, or that really long list I mentioned before. But from a Sjogren's specific standpoint, or if you have chronic lung disease associated with Sjogren's, that's a risk factor. But from a immunocompromised status, it's the drugs, and the drugs we think of most commonly as suppressing the immune system to a significant degree are prednisone, other steroids, Medrol, methotrexate, rituximab, Cellcept, Areva, so ones most commonly used in Sjogren's. Drugs that do not compromise the immune system, Plaquenil, hydroxychloroquine, or NSAIDs, Advil, Mrna, ibuprofen, or Tylenol for that matter. Drugs that we know reduce the effectiveness of COVID vaccines. So if you're on one of these drugs when you got the COVID vaccine, potential to reduce the effectiveness. Rituximab, number one, significantly reduces the risk of or response to COVID vaccine. Methotrexate, Cellcept, higher doses of prednisone and other steroids do have potential to reduce your vaccine response. So if you're taking these medicines, you should discuss with your rheumatologist about timing of vaccine and around your medications. As Janet said, I'm on the American College of Rheumatology COVID-19 vaccine task force, where we had the tall task of reviewing all the data and coming together with the recommendations for the best way to vaccinate patients with rheumatic diseases against COVID-19. And in here, we have recommendations about discussing with patients about potentially timing vaccine around certain medicines if it's right for that patient. One example from in here is if you're on methotrexate, you may discuss with your doctor about holding a dose or two after one or both of your COVID vaccines, if your disease activity allows and if you feel comfortable. The goal of increasing your immune system response to that vaccine Rituximab, as I said, is the most challenging because not only are patients on rituximab have the highest risk of getting really sick, but they also have the poorest COVID vaccine response. It really reduces the effectiveness of COVID vaccine and a lot of other vaccines, flu and pneumococcal vaccines. So in general, when possible, we recommend to wait as long after your last rituximab infusion as possible, and then 2 to 4 weeks before your next infusion. This is not optimal timing. This is not always possible, and rituximab-treated patients remain at higher risk of poor outcomes from COVID, even despite vaccine. This is why it's absolutely important to be an educated patient, to know what to look out for, to know what to do if you test positive for COVID or around someone with COVID. Know to call your rheumatologist, know to talk about the only currently available outpatient treatment for patients who are high risk and get COVID, which are monoclonal antibodies, and know how to get one of those for you. I encourage all my patients to let me know, like yesterday, if they were around someone with COVID with a high risk contact, or if they have any upper respiratory tract symptoms. I encourage them to keep rapid home testing kits at home. You wake up with a stuffy nose, your kid wakes up with a stuffy nose, they got to go to school, rapid COVID test them, and call your doctor if it's positive. I think this is so important. I've had far too many experiences where I find out too late about, in particular, my rituximab patients, the ones we worry about most, that they had COVID and there was something I could have potentially done to help, but we had moved past the window because I didn't find out till later. Breakthrough. This is really important. You've probably heard the term breakthrough. This means you get COVID even though you were fully vaccinated, broke through the protective barrier for the vaccine. And unfortunately, this is not uncommon. The good thing is that being vaccinated for most people, short of people being on rituximab and high-dose steroids and some of those other medicines, being fully vaccinated still significantly protects you from being hospitalized or dying from COVID. But breakthrough infection can occur in completely healthy people with no risk factors who are fully vaccinated, and it's still very infectious. And this is why COVID is still a tremendous problem, and why it's so important that everyone be vaccinated and everyone be boosted. There we have learned there's increased incidence of breakthrough infection in rheumatic disease patients. It depends on several factors, including which immunosuppressive drug you're on. Biggest risk factors for getting breakthrough infection are being older, being on rituximab. Those similar factors are also associated with being sicker with breakthrough infection, in particular rituximab. And in particular, if you have more than one risk factor, like you're on rituximab and you're older, or rituximab and lung disease. Another important point to note is that breakthrough infection presents differently. If I had a dime for every patient that wrote me a message asking for like a Z-Pack for a sinus infection, and I then had go get tested for COVID and had COVID, I'd have a lot of money. It's different. It's upper respiratory tract symptoms. It's sneezing. I've had patients think they're having just allergies acting up, and it's COVID. Sore throat, sneezing, runny nose, headache, loss of smell. These are symptoms of breakthrough COVID. So be aware, get tested, isolate, and call your doctor. Other popular questions are, how long does it take for a third COVID vaccine dose to take full effect? 14 days after that dose. Any news on other formulas for vaccines, like a pill or a nasal spray? Not in the near future, but there are clinical trials of nasal spray vaccines ongoing, but I don't think they're very close to the end product or being authorized for use. Will COVID vaccines and boosters become annual like the flu shot? I think that's really to be determined. And as anything with COVID, much of what I tell you today could be incredibly different next month, and we'll just continue to learn more. But we're hoping that after, the booster or the booster, as I call it, that fourth dose for certain immunocompromised persons, this might not be necessarily need to be annual. There are many instances of vaccines that we give to kids. So kids who have never had the infection before and get vaccinated with 4 or 5 shots. Tetanus, for example, and pertussis, and then that 4-dose series provides long-lasting immunity, and they don't need another one for a long while. So we're hopeful it'll be something like that. But we don't know the answer to that, and that's a really good question. I look forward to hopefully answering a lot of these questions. And as always, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm here to help provide the right information and make you more comfortable with your questions and concerns, and answer any vaccine related questions. I'm happy to do so. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Calabrese. Now, unfortunately, just to let you know, some people, it looked like maybe a third of us could not hear you. There's something going on with between systems. So hopefully our recording will.
I hope so. Sorry, I didn't know that.
Well, no, well, and for many of us, it was perfectly fine. So I can
sorry
hear
to everyone that
you
couldn't or
fine.
can't hear me.
Yeah. So hopefully our recording will, hopefully you can hear me, and hopefully our recording will be clear and you can get so many of your questions answered. But I think you could also see the slides quite clearly and be able to get a lot of the information. But we did ask people to write in questions, and I have a whole list of questions that you all submitted. And so I'll go ahead and ask the ones that are submitted, and then I'll try to get to some of the very unique ones that I'm seeing fly by in chat and Q&A and et cetera.
Great.
And I'm going to ask the most common questions that we got first. A lot of people are curious about COVID antibody testing. Like, where are they in terms of the need of a booster, and what level are they trying to get to? The bigger question to me is how, even with that question out there, how would someone go about getting that testing?
That's a really great question. This comes up almost daily. The short answer is we don't fully know how to interpret spike protein antibody tests. A positive antibody test doesn't tell the whole picture about vaccine protection. It doesn't tell us about the T cell response. There's most importantly, no correlative level of cutoff. So like above this number is good and below this number is bad. We don't even have that. So it's actually not recommended to check spike protein antibodies, and that's recommended by the CDC. However, we in practice do use this on occasion, and most importantly in rituximab treated patients who have no B cells and are very unlikely to have responded, although some of them do. So when we have a rituximab treated patient after their booster, we often check a spike protein antibody, and if that's 0, we think that's not good. And that's about all we can say right now. And then that's someone who has to maintain absolute caution. Still might benefit from a 4th vaccine dose, but I didn't talk about this at all, very minimally. Monoclonal antibodies for treatment of COVID coming down the pipeline are something called pre-exposure prophylaxis. These are going to be authorized in the coming weeks for patients like rituximab patients. You'll get a sub-Q injection of a spike protein monoclonal antibody, and it will protect you from COVID for 6 to 8 months. This is going to be the next phase of COVID. But otherwise, negative spike protein antibody, not good. Positive, probably good, but it doesn't give you like free reign to, go into a mosh pit. It doesn't mean you're fully protected from COVID. And there's lots of commercial assays. We at the Cleveland Clinic have, particular authorized providers who can order this, but important to know if the test is checking for spike protein antibody, which will be positive after natural infection or vaccine, or nucleoprotein antibody, which is only positive after vaccine. I've seen many patients come with a negative nucleoprotein antibody and are worried, and that's not going to be positive no matter how many vaccines you got. It's only positive if you got an infection. So they're all over. You probably don't need one unless you have significant immunosuppression, then it might be important to check that.
Okay.
Hopefully I can have a shorter answer for all the other questions.
No, but once again, a complex answer. We still don't know as much as we wish we did. So you did address a bit of the Pfizer Moderna booster. Third full dose for people who are immune immunocompromised, and especially in certain age ranges. But the half dose, we've had
Yes.
several people say that should they want the full dose instead of just the half dose, could they ask for it? Is it more risky to get the full dose? And is there, there's been a couple questions about hydroxychloroquine and half the full dose.
Yeah, both good points. First with the Mrna, the reason the booster dose for non-immunocompromised persons is a half dose is because they looked at this and the big clinical trials, and that half dose confers just as good protection with less reactogenicity and like any study that didn't look at immunocompromised persons. So the recommendation does not apply to immunocompromised persons. So if you fall in that immunocompromised category, you should get a full dose Mrna. If you got a half dose Mrna, I think that's totally fine. And I truly don't actually think it matters at all. And I've actually had many patients go to Walgreens and they check the immunocompromised box and they still got the half dose booster, and everyone is confused and continues to be confused. I think that's fine. Should you ask? I don't know if you ask for a full dose, they'll give you one. They might, and that's fine too. I don't think you'd need to, but the data for effectiveness of half dose are excellent, and that's why it's recommended. At the end of the day, I don't really think it matters. Hydroxychloroquine has been really hot topic since the start of the pandemic, and early on was hopeful it was going to be a cure-all and preventative strategy for COVID, but to share with you the data of countless studies, hydroxychloroquine, while it does not increase your risk of getting COVID or getting sick with COVID, it does not protect you from COVID, and it does not treat COVID. We know this very well. Being on hydroxychloroquine is not protecting you from COVID in any way, and we do not prescribe it to treat COVID because it is not effective.
Okay. And it does, and hydroxychloroquine has no impact to a vaccine, negative or positive.
Correct. And yeah, we love hydroxychloroquine because it doesn't suppress your immune system, it doesn't impact vaccines, and it doesn't increase your risk of infection. So that's great.
That is great. For those of us who are on that, that's great.
Yeah.
I'm going to pull, Margaret Rose, I'm going to pull your question in because I don't want to lose it, because in several of our COVID conversations, we haven't specifically brought up Laflunamide,
Okay.
one of the drugs. So
Yeah.
touch base on that.
Yeah, if it wasn't on my list, I apologize. It is an immunosuppressant. It's on that list with methotrexate. It does reduce vaccine responses. The bad thing about laflunamide is it stays in your system for a really long time, and holding it for any period of time after getting your vaccine response to increase responses is not going to do much of anything. But it does slightly reduce vaccine responses. We're not sure how significantly, probably not that much. And it does suppress your immune system, and someone on laflunamide would be considered immunocompromised.
Okay, thank you so much. We had a couple of questions about Sjogren's patients asking if they do get COVID, what is the treatment recommendation? Like, what should they do really fast and be communicating?
Great question. The path to successful COVID treatment, it requires informed patient and informed provider. The most important thing is that you have an awareness for needing to be tested for COVID, and that you do that, or if you're not sure, call your doctor. And then if you're positive, if you meet certain criteria for being a high-risk patient, which is a long laundry list of things, including being 65 and older, or obese, or diabetes, or heart disease, et cetera, or being on rituximab or prednisone, then you are a candidate for a monoclonal antibody. It's the only currently available outpatient treatment for COVID designed for patients with risk factors for getting really sick. It is an infusion. It must be given within 10 days of symptom onset. The earlier, the better. And your doctor hopefully knows how to get this to you, but this has been also a big strategy. The Cleveland Clinic, I could do all the ordering and talking to all of the rheumatology patients for monoclonal antibodies. We've been very, very busy. What I always tell patients, if their doctor isn't sure, or if a doctor isn't sure, to contact your local infectious disease provider who will absolutely know what to do. But this is the only treatment for outpatient COVID right now. If you're in the hospital, you'd probably get IV remdesivir, which is an antiviral. If you were in the hospital and having hypoxia, low oxygen levels, you would get steroids, dexamethasone. And then if you're really sick or on a ventilator, there's some other medicines we use. But for outpatients, all you need to know is to get tested and tell your doctor that you have COVID and ask if you meet criteria for getting a spike protein monoclonal antibody infusion.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. We had a couple of questions about people being confused about whether they can take the flu vaccine at the same time as the booster, and someone that had actually done that, thinking it was fine, be told that they should have been 2 weeks apart by a medical professional. So can you clarify?
I'm glad you brought that up. So back in the COVID day, several months ago, it actually was recommended to space any vaccine out by 2 weeks from COVID vaccine, just because we don't have any data. And while we still don't have any data, we now feel this is safe. So you can get your flu shot and your COVID shot on the same day, even in the same arm. That is completely fine. Encourage you to do so if it increases your chances of getting both vaccines.
That's wonderful. Yeah, maybe different arms. Ouch.
Maybe different arms. My husband got his both in the same arm yesterday.
But it's safe. It is safe.
He's okay so far.
It is safe. We had quite a number of people who initially got the J&J vaccine, so thinking one dose, and have been hearing that suggestions to get Pfizer or Moderna for the additional mRNA boost. What could you go over?
That's a good question, where the recommendations are not so clear, and CDC hasn't really drilled down on talking about immunocompromised persons who got J&J initially, or really anyone who got J&J initially. All of the above are fine. Any additional dose is better than no additional dose. If you got Johnson & Johnson and get another Johnson & Johnson, that's great. If you got Johnson & Johnson and then got a Pfizer or Moderna before that second J&J recommendation was out, that's great too. There are actually data that show that after one Johnson & Johnson, if you get Pfizer or Moderna, your immune boost is probably a lot higher than getting a second J&J. They're all good and they all protect against hospitalization and death. So while me in particular and my colleagues are in favor of potentially getting a Pfizer or Mrna instead of a second J&J, getting a second J&J is also completely fine.
Great, great. Let's see. Do you have any knowledge about current research going on about COVID and Sjogren's patients or autoimmune patients and vaccines? And
yeah, that's a great question. There is a ton going on this level. I'm not aware of any studies only looking at Sjogren's patients, but there are countless studies looking at rheumatic disease patients en masse, including Sjogren's patients across the country, across the world. Me at the Cleveland Clinic myself, I'm in charge of 2 studies looking at all rituximab treated patients in particular, including Sjogren's patients, looking at their vaccine response and looking at their outcomes if they have breakthrough. But ongoing are huge studies, many studies looking at outcomes, looking at breakthrough, looking at vaccine responses, looking at responses after a second dose, a third dose, a fourth dose, looking at when is the right time to vaccinate someone on rituximab. There's so much stuff going on. It's really great.
That is awesome. So we're going to learn a lot in the future.
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned. Absolutely. Let's see. I did see a couple of others that I think are worth our time. Do we at this point have any knowledge about how, let's say we all take our booster, so we go through this booster or third dose, whatever we do at this point that's right for us. Do we have any indication about how long the efficacy of this level will be?
That's a very good question. The short answer is no, but we hope it to be very good for a while.
Yeah, very good.
Potentially even forever,
Okay.
depending on your immune status. But we don't know. We don't know if you're going to need another booster or a yearly booster. We hope not a yearly booster, but we just don't know.
Yep, yep. That's what all this research is going to do for us.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then I happened to see on the news this evening that I wanted to ask about. I came home, turned on the news before jumping into our town hall today, and I saw that Pfizer has just submitted for FDA approval a COVID antiviral treatment. And I bet you a few people on the call with us tonight also saw that news story. Can you tell us about that?
Absolutely. It's really exciting news. We all along, since we're so limited in outpatient COVID treatment, like I said, we only have monoclonal antibodies and they're not for everyone. Been in long need of another option for outpatient treatment. So now this Pfizer antiviral, I believe it's called Paxlovid, is being submitted for EUA, and it is an outpatient oral antiviral that if you got infected with COVID, you would start early taking this pill every day, and it would reduce your risk of getting really sick. We've long awaited this, something like you all, I'm sure, who've had the flu have taken Tamiflu to make your flu go away quicker and be less infectious, or even as post-exposure prophylaxis, like for a pregnant woman is around someone who has the flu, we give her Tamiflu so she doesn't get the flu. So we hope for these to be used in that way. And this is really exciting and hopefully will prevent some hospitalizations, but the best mode of prevention or treatment remains prevention with vaccines. I anticipate once this is authorized, it will be prioritized similarly to the monoclonals, with you can have it if you're high risk, and not for everyone, at least at the get-go. So that's a lot of people, but
Yeah,
very exciting.
that is very exciting. And then I have an interesting question coming into our Q&A that we kind of haven't touched on. We have someone, Sarah, that was not immunocompromised, immunosuppressed when they had their full vaccination. I'm reading this in a way that she probably got her first 2 vaccinations, but then after that started methotrexate. Um, is she now considered high risk, and did starting afterwards do anything to her antibody level? What would be her recommendation at that
That's
point?
a great scenario and a great question. And she did absolutely perfectly getting vaccinated before you start immunosuppression. That is always the goal. We very infrequently have opportunity to give someone their vaccines before they start immunosuppression. That's perfect. We hope for you to have a great antibody response to your vaccines. While you are now immunocompromised because you're on methotrexate, we hope that you had a great response to your vaccines because you had them before you got methotrexate.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, everyone, Cassie, I can't thank you enough for joining us again. And that really comes to the end of our session this evening. Everyone, I see a whole bunch of questions still coming at us, and many of them were addressed this evening. Hopefully the replay, you can hear it a little bit better. But also you have several questions that were addressed in Cassie's first presentation and even Dr. Baer's presentation. If you go to our website and look at all of the COVID vaccine presentations, you will hear things that might answer some of your straightforward questions, such as the common symptoms after getting a vaccine. But hopefully this answered a lot of your questions and informed you so you can make the best decision to care for yourself and stay healthy. I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful Thanksgiving holiday next week, and a special Thanksgiving holiday to you, Dr. Calabrese. And again, thank you so much for spending this time with us and for keeping us up to date, informed. And I'm sure we'll have some patients taking this video and having their medical providers review it. So maybe they'll reach out to you as well. So
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I'm sorry I didn't get to everyone's questions. They're all really great questions. I hope this was helpful. And also sorry for everyone that couldn't hear. I hope the recording works. Let me know if it doesn't.
Okay. Okay. Thanks so much.
Y'all
Thanks,
take care.
everyone.
Stay well.
You too. Bye. Good night, everyone. Thank you for all your support, members.